you ever heard a story so spooky it makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? A tale whispered around crackling fires on chilly autumn nights. Well, gather close, because tonight we're journeying to a quiet little place called Sleepy Hollow, a village haunted by a legend so terrifying it has echoed through centuries. Our story begins in this drowsy, dreamy valley, nestled along the Hudson River. The air here is thick with a strange, bewitching quality. People move a little slower, their minds wander a little further, and they are prone to seeing the most marvelous and frightening things. The whole place seems to be under some kind of spell. But the most famous specter, the one that commands all the others, is the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head was carried away by a cannonball during the Revolutionary War. He is known forever after as the Headless Horseman. They say he rides forth to the scene of the battle every night in search of his head, and that he must rush back to the churchyard where he is buried before daybreak. He is the undisputed king of this enchanted region, a nightly terror that gallops through the darkness on his powerful black steed. Now, into this land of shadows and superstitions came a most peculiar man, Ichabod Crane. He wasn't from Sleepy Hollow. He was a schoolmaster from Connecticut, tall and exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, and hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves. His head was small and flat on top, wheat-huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose. To see him striding along the crest of a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might mistake him for some scarecrow that had escaped from a cornfield. But what Ichabod lacked in looks, he made up for in appetite and imagination. He was a man of great learning, at least in his own mind, and a fine singer. He led the church choir on Sundays, and his voice could be heard rising above all the others. He was also a firm believer in all things supernatural. He loved to spend long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives, listening to their marvelous tales of ghosts, goblins, and, of course, the Headless Horseman. He would devour these stories with a fearful pleasure, and then walk home, terrified by every rustle of a leaf and every shadow that crossed his path. Despite his fears, Ichabod had his eye on a prize in Sleepy Hollow, the lovely Katrina Van Tassel, the only daughter of a wealthy old farmer. Katrina was a blooming lass of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, rosy, and known for her beauty and, more importantly, her vast inheritance. Ichabod's imagination ran wild not just with thoughts of Katrina, but of her father's farm, the sprawling fields of wheat, rye, and corn, the fat pigs and poultry, and the magnificent old farmhouse overflowing with treasures. He imagined himself the master of this domain, with Katrina as his wife. But Ichabod was not the only suitor for Katrina's hand. He had a formidable rival, Abraham Van Brunt, known throughout the countryside as Brom Bones. Brom was the hero of the region, a broad-shouldered, double-jointed man with curly black hair and a mischievous, but good-humored, face. He was famous for his strength and his skill on horseback. He was the leader of a gang of rustic lads who looked up to him for all their fun and frolics. Brom was also smitten with Katrina, and he was not about to let a lanky, gangling schoolmaster get in his way. Brom and his gang began a campaign of practical jokes against Ichabod. They smoked out a singing school by stopping up the chimney. They broke into the schoolhouse at night and turned everything upside down, and they made his life a general misery. But Ichabod, for all his foolishness, was persistent. He continued his courtship of Katrina, undeterred by Brom's antics. The rivalry came to a head one fine autumn evening. A messenger arrived at the schoolhouse inviting Ichabod to a grand party at the Van Tassel farm. Ichabod was ecstatic. He dismissed his students early, spent an extra hour getting ready, and borrowed a horse from a grumpy old farmer named Hans Van Ripper. The horse, whose name was Gunpowder, was as broken down and stubborn as its owner. It was a bony old nag with one eye and a fiery temper. But Ichabod didn't care. Astride this sorry steed, he trotted off to the party, his heart full of hope. The Van Tassel mansion was a scene of warmth and cheer. The tables groaned under the weight of food. Pies, cakes, donuts, and all sorts of delicious Dutch delicacies. Ichabod ate with the appetite of a man who hadn't seen food in a week. He danced with Katrina, feeling for a moment that he had truly won her heart. As the evening wore on, the guests gathered around the fire to tell ghost stories. Brom Bones, with a twinkle in his eye, told a particularly vivid tale about his own encounter with the Headless Horseman. He claimed he had raced the ghost one night and would have beaten him, but just as he reached the bridge near the old church, the horseman vanished in a flash of fire and brimstone. The stories filled Ichabod's head with terrifying images. When the party finally ended, he was in a state of high anxiety. He sought out Katrina for a private word, but whatever passed between them, he left the mansion looking dejected and crestfallen. Something had gone terribly wrong. Perhaps she had rejected him. With a heavy heart, Ichabod mounted old Gunpowder and began his lonely journey home. The hour was late, and the world seemed darker and more silent than ever before. The stories from the party replayed in his mind, each one more frightening than the last. Every shadow seemed to take on a monstrous shape. He whistled to keep up his courage, but his own tune sounded eerie in the dead of night. As he approached a particularly spooky part of the road, near a great tulip tree that was a local landmark for ghost stories, his heart began to pound. He passed the tree safely, but then, in the darkness of a narrow hollow, he saw it. A hulking, shadowy figure, mounted on a powerful black horse, silent and motionless. Ichabod's blood ran cold. He tried to urge Gunpowder forward, but the old horse wouldn't move. The figure stirred and put itself in motion, keeping pace with Ichabod in the shadows. Ichabod tried to sing a psalm tune, but his voice trembled. The shadowy stranger moved into the moonlight, and Ichabod's worst fears were realized. The figure was large and imposing, but what froze him with terror was that it was headless, and on the pommel of its saddle, it carried its own severed head. Panic seized Ichabod. He kicked and spurred Gunpowder with all his might. The old horse, for once, seemed to share its rider's terror, and bolted forward in a mad dash. The chase was on. Horse and rider flew through the night, the Headless Horseman in hot pursuit. Ichabod could hear the thundering hooves of the ghost's steed right behind him. He remembered Bram Bones' story there. Church, bridge. If he could just reach the bridge, he would be safe. The ghosts supposedly couldn't cross it. With the church in sight, he gave Gunpowder one last desperate kick. They thundered onto the bridge. Ichabod risked a glance back, expecting to see the horseman vanish. But the ghost was still there. It rose in its stirrups and hurled its severed head directly at him. Ichabod tried to dodge, but it was too late. The ghastly projectile struck him squarely on the head, and he tumbled from his horse into the dust. Everything went black. The next morning, old Gunpowder was found wandering without his saddle near his master's gate. Ichabod Crane had vanished. A search party found the saddle trampled in the dirt of the road, and near the bridge, they found something else. The shattered remains of a pumpkin. Ichabod was never seen in Sleepy Hollow again. The old country wives maintained that he was spirited away by the Headless Horseman. But some people, when they told the story, would laugh and wink. They noticed that Bram Bones, who shortly after married the lovely Katrina, always looked exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod and the pumpkin was told. And so, the legend lives on. The schoolhouse fell into decay, but the tale of the lanky schoolmaster and his terrifying ride is still told. So if you ever find yourself in a quiet valley on a dark autumn night, listen closely. You might just hear the distant sound of hooves, galloping in a desperate nightly search. Thanks for joining me on this spooky journey into the heart of American folklore. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more Tillies from the Shadows, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Stay curious and stay safe.